embrace, inspire, and change.
Hi, everyone. This is Heather Vickery, and you've tuned in to the Brave Files podcast. Welcome. I am thrilled to have you here with us this week. Imagine what it's like to be the daughter of immigrants and then become one yourself. I mean, honestly, especially here in America, where being an immigrant has become such a hot and often dangerous thing to be, topic to discuss, all of the above. When it comes to immigration, there are a few things that we know to be true. Immigrants work hard no matter where they go in order to build a new life for themselves. And in America, at least, the experience of being an immigrant is vastly different depending on where you're immigrating from. And listen, we all come from somewhere, even Americans. The country's not even that old, right? Forgetting that we all come from somewhere else is doing a disservice to us as a nation. This week, I talk with Tamina Watson, the daughter of immigrants in the United Kingdom, who unexpectedly became an immigrant herself here in the U.S. Tamina knows the ins and outs of immigration, but she never expected to follow in her father's footsteps and become an immigration lawyer herself. She joins us today to talk about her journey, her successes, her challenges, and why it's so important to inspire change and support for immigrants all over the world. Tamina is an expert in this. She has created some incredible nonprofit organizations that are changing the lives for immigrants here in the U.S. She's got several best-selling books out and an incredible podcast. She's here to tell us all about it. Please help me welcome Tamina Watson, and let's get started. This is Heather Vickery, and you're listening to The Brave Files, stories from people living courageously. When we choose bravely in big and small ways, it powerfully elevates our lives. I hope these stories connect with you and encourage you to embrace bravery in every possible way, day after day. Together, we can build a movement of courageous living that enriches both our lives and our communities. And if you enjoy the show, I ask you to please share it with others. Maybe think of someone who you want to choose bravely right alongside you. Thanks for tuning in. Now here's the show. Hey friends, welcome back to the Brave Files. You know, being an immigrant in the United States is not for the weak of heart. And yet, so many people still feel it is the best decision for themselves and their families. Today's guest, Tamina Watson, moved to the U.S. in the early 2000s from the U.K., where she was already practicing law. She had no idea what was in store for her when she decided to emigrate to the United States and then practice law here. Her focus, to her own surprise, has become immigration law. I'm really excited to have this conversation because, if you are aware and alive and checking out the news cycle in the United States right now, immigration is a hot topic and one that I feel really passionate about. She's also the host of Tamina Talks Immigration podcast and the author of several books. We're going to learn all about that. Tamina, welcome to the Brave Files.
Thank you so much for having me, Heather. I'm very honored.
I love it. And you have such a lovely, soothing voice. I have to listen to your podcast just so I can get my daily dose of that beautiful voice of yours.
That's very kind. Thank you so much.
All right. So where were you? You were born in the UK, yes?
I was born in the UK, and then for a few years of my informative years, I lived in Bangladesh, where my parents are from. So my parents were immigrants to the United Kingdom, and my dad had moved to the United Kingdom from Bangladesh in the 60s, and then got married to my mother in the 70s, and so my mother moved to the UK. And then I was born, and I lived in the UK until I was 8, and then 8 to 18, I lived in Bangladesh. Went back to London, and then I moved to the United States when I got married to my incredible husband and moved to Seattle. And I tell everybody that we had a sleepless in Seattle moment, and then it was
I love that.
it was a blind date, and I was on the plane going home thinking, oh my gosh, I think I'm going to marry this guy, but how am I going to see him again? you
That's
know.
amazing. That's its whole own episode. Tamina, we'll have to have you back to
Oh, I can't
talk
wait,
about that.
And so then I moved here and I settled into Seattle and I call this home. And I've been
I
here
love
since
Seattle.
2005. It's beautiful. I love it.
It is one of my favorite cities. It may be my favorite city in the US, I
Well,
think, that I've at least that I've
wonderful.
visited.
Well, you'll
Yeah,
have to
it's
come and stay with us in
well,
Seattle.
I would love that. I thank you for the invitation.
Ye-
Okay, so that's interesting that you are an immigrant, you are the child of immigrants, so you really grew up in an immersive immigration experience, right? Because I am not an immigrant. I'm super American. I'm part Native American and all sorts of other mutt sort, like it goes back and probably has family who did all sorts of horrible things that we owe restitution for. That's not the point. But I have been told, and the research and the work that I've done is that there's quite an immigrant mentality. My partner is the daughter of Irish immigrants. And so they had the immigrant mentality. She talks about it a lot. Can you share what does that mean to you? And then twofold, is it different, do you think, having immigrated to the United Kingdom versus to the United States? What things are the same and what things are different?
Yeah, very good question. So when I was born and raised in London, I never felt like an immigrant in the UK. Yes, I had, different languages being spoken at home, and we had, cultural diversity within our community. And I was raised that way, but I never felt like an immigrant. Never considered myself an immigrant. I'm a Brit, British Bengali. That's the way I
Yeah.
identified myself. But when I moved to the United States, I definitely felt like an immigrant. I had to go through the paperwork myself before
Right.
was an immigration lawyer. I had to go through, how do I become legal here? How do I get a green card? How do I get citizenship? I had to go through all of that, and I hired a lawyer to do all of those things. Even though my husband and I are both lawyers, it's such a complicated process that neither of
Yeah.
us could really figure it out on our own. So I became a green card holder initially, and I definitely felt like an immigrant through and through. I felt stuck here when I couldn't, I was pending the green card process. I had to figure out how to get a job, how to write my resume. While the UK and US speak English, there's still,
Yeah.
a cultural and language divide in many respects. How you spell it, languages, how do you use words, and especially in the legal arena, some words say and look the same except they mean different things.
Absolutely.
And so that education was interesting, but I always felt like an immigrant. Now, coming to the profession of immigration um, lawyering, it was not something I wanted to do. In
Okay.
fact, immigration was something I didn't want to practice.
Ooh. So I want to
Mhm.
learn more about that. But before we get there, I know you were UK born, so you were not an immigrant there, but did you see that resonate with your parents at all or no?
Very much, very much. And I don't think my dad very spoke about it much, but in the 60s and 70s, the UK definitely had a lot of issues like we face here. And I know that he faced racism and discrimination and so forth. And he was a lawyer, he was a barrister in the UK, and he was a very good immigration lawyer, actually. But what happened in those days, in the 60s and 70s, immigration wasn't the sexy thing to do as it is now. It was very much a community oriented aspect of life. So he was a UK immigration barrister helping the community with their
Interesting.
issues. Over time, immigration now is what it is. It's very much a hot topic. Um,
Yes.
but that's what he did, and I think his experiences of coming from very humble beginnings to then aspiring to becoming a lawyer, and then having my mother, as the woman behind the man, very much that kind of dynamic. Um, they both had to experience that. So I don't know from their own perspective how their immigrant experience was. I never really felt to ask them until I became an immigration lawyer and my dad's not here anymore. But
Oh, I'm
I
sorry.
do know that they had their own experiences. I remember a story that, I don't haven't talked about this ever, I don't think, but I think there was a pride of, I have worked hard to have this life here. And I remember one of our neighbors maybe trying to give me hand-me-downs, and I think my dad was very insulted by that.
Oh,
It was very
fascinating.
interesting. I don't I It just popped into my head. I don't think I've really thought about that incident much, but I think immigrants work hard no matter where they go to build a life for
Absolutely.
themselves. And that's what my parents did. And, I'm the beneficiary of all the hard work that they have done and the
Yeah.
sacrifices they made. And I very much carry that with me in my day to day. And when I think about my children, they're living a very different life to what I did and to what my
Oh, yeah.
parents did. And of course, they're American. I sometimes think of, Tom and Jerry cartoon shows because I grew up in the UK and the American accent was very much like on cartoons. I don't think I've said this to them either, but it's interesting because I sometimes think to myself, how do I instill these values that are so important to me? Do not be wasteful. Do not, look down upon people. Do not, how do you embrace the diversity around you and see everything as an asset? How do you be helpful to others? How can you show kindness and love? But I think when you are growing up in that immigrant household and you're trying to prove yourself where you have to work a little harder than others, to be honest,
Yeah.
I don't know if that will necessarily be ingrained in my children because it's a very different lifestyle. So I constantly think about those things. But I think what you're asking is a very important question because us who are immigrants, whether it's the UK, Canada, or anywhere else, we live the values of our parents, having seen how hard they
Yeah.
worked to make it wherever they are.
That's the same, I think, for any underprivileged community,
Absolutely.
right? I mean, the layers and levels of privilege are all there, right? There's the top of the pecking order, the top of the food chain who has the most privilege, the straight white man, straight white Christian man has, he's got the cream of the crop. But in every group, there's some layer of privilege, whether it could be anything, whether you've been able to, luckily enough to have access to education, maybe when other community members haven't, or whatever. Um, it's so fascinating to me. And I really want to talk about how you ended up doing immigration law, which is so fascinating that your dad did it. It makes sense to me. You're like, I don't really want to touch that. So I'm really excited to hear that. But before we get there, from my perspective, and my perspective is really just based on podcasts that I listen to and the news and whatnot. The immigration experience is vastly different in the United States depending on where you are immigrating from. Now, that isn't to say I have a very good friend who was British and they got married and they're still struggling to get their green card and get all of that worked out. And it's a pain in the ass, but that's maybe to be expected as an immigrant. But it, am I right? Like, is the immigrant experience different based on where you're immigrating from in this country?
Yes, it can be. Now, the process is the same for everybody. You have to do, these 10 steps. But of these 10 steps, step 6 and 7, I'm just throwing out numbers so people can understand, they can be different in how long you have to wait. So,
Yeah.
for example, if you're trying to get a green card through work, like a Microsoft or Amazon. I live in Seattle, so these companies roll off
Yes.
my tongue. you know, uh, if they were to sponsor you and you're from India, you're waiting maybe 2 decades to get a green card. But if they're sponsoring you and you're from Britain, you're probably waiting a year and a half at most. depending,
Wow.
on where you are in this sponsorship, preference category. And so that's where the difference can be, how long you're waiting. The other thing that can happen is the perception of you.
That's the
It's
experience of it, not necessarily the
yes.
process. Yeah.
So the previous administration had used choice words for different, groups of
Mm.
people,
That's such a
and that
nice way to say that. Not that I think it's deserved, but that was a nice way to say that.
well, I think there's so much conflict going on in the world. Let's try to just find ways to be kind about things that don't deserve to be kind otherwise. But in any event, it's the people that matter, and it's the people that feel the hurt. And when words are used to describe people, what happens is it gives a license to those who share that mentality to be unkind even further. And
Absolutely.
so we've seen that in droves. We've seen that at different levels of unkindness to, all the way to violence, fatal violence. And so the experience of the immigrant, not necessarily from the process perspective, but the life perspective, is very different depending on where you come from.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your perspective on that. That's pretty much how I see it as well. So it isn't any different than it's being portrayed. I'm not laughing. It's not funny. It's horrifying. And this is a whole different topic for a whole different podcast, but it's also really indicative of this country and how this country was built and founded, and um, sad, but not surprising. All right. How in the world did you end up? What kind of law did you practice in the UK, and what did you think you would do here?
Do I never really wanted to live in America. So it wasn't an aspiration. What I
Okay.
really wanted to do was be a lawyer. I wanted to be a barrister like my father. I'd grown up with lawyers around me. My grandfather was a lawyer. My uncles were lawyers. It was almost like it was a given I was going to be a lawyer and a barrister particularly. And just for your listeners, information in the UK, there are two types of lawyers, if you like. One is a trial attorney, one is a transactional attorney. The trial attorney is referred to as a barrister. They go to court, they
Okay.
wear a wig and gown. I really wanted to wear my wig and gown.
I want to see a picture of you in your wig and gown.
Oh, I'll have to find one. Um, it's interesting because I don't know what to do with it anywhere. It's boxed away somewhere. And I think when I get a fancy office sometime, I think I'll put it in a light little, glass,
Yes.
thing. Uh, I have had suggestions to wear it on Halloween, but that's not what I want to do with that.
Fair
And then
enough.
the transactional lawyer is a solicitor.
Okay.
And so I wanted to do that, and I thought I would, when I started practicing law in the UK, did 70% criminal defense law and 30% civil law. And the system is very different in the UK. Once you come out of law school, you actually have to get experience, get an apprenticeship, and that is for 1 year. Once you finish the apprenticeship, that's when you get your license to practice, which is different
Okay.
from the US, where you finish your undergraduate degree, then go to get your graduate degree, then do the bar exams, and then you have the license without experience. In the UK, they want you to have experience before you're let loose, so to speak. And
Makes a
so
lot of
it's very,
sense.
and I think so too, actually. I am not an advocate necessarily for changing things on the, law school front, but I think there's a lot of merit to having that type of experience before you are helping people. So I did that, and it's very competitive to get that apprenticeship. It's called pupillage in the UK. Now it's called traineeship, I believe. It's changed a lot in the last 20 years. And I was very lucky to get that, but I was lucky only because I worked really hard. It's luck meets
Yeah.
opportunity. And I did a lot of pro bono work to get experience to be able to get that opportunity.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I hadn't thought about those pro bono experiences I had until I was writing my book in October 2020 when it was published. Because what I realized, there's a common thread throughout my experience of helping vulnerable people with the skills I have in that moment. So, as a law school student, and this is what I impart to law school students, is that they still know more than the average person who needs help. You can use that knowledge at law school to be able to help a vulnerable immigrant, a vulnerable person losing their house. You can use that experience to help vulnerable parents who need extra educational assistance for their children. And I did all of these things in the UK. Because I needed my apprenticeship, I actually threw myself into pro bono work for a whole year, having just a Saturday job for my pocket money. And what was interesting is I learned so much that I didn't even realize how much I was learning until in this old age, so to speak.
Yeah.
Once you're a parent, I started to appreciate all of those parents I was helping at a different level. A lot of the parents I was helping were trying to get extra educational assistance for their children, whether it was to get a wheelchair assisted, accommodations, or whether it was in the UK, it's called a statement, plan, an educational plan,
Hmm.
where if your child has social emotional learning disabilities, how do you get extra help for that? If they're dyslexic, how do you get help? The issue that I saw with those parents was, how do you even get your child diagnosed? A lot of
Yeah.
parents would say, well, I just get labeled as a bad parent. I know I'm not a bad mother. I know that my child needs more help, but I'm just getting labeled as a bad parent. While I was zealously helping my client in the paperwork,
Yeah.
it's only years later that as a parent, I couldn't even begin to imagine what they were going through and how relieved they must have been to have some legal assistance.
Yeah.
So that law student who's trying to get experience can truly use that little learning that they have and use mentors and supervisors as law schools to really make an impact on somebody's life. And that
Mm,
thread has carried throughout my life that I hadn't thought about until recently.
I love that. I appreciate that so much. So what I'm hearing you say is that folks who are in law school, you can get some on the ground practical work and really make a difference in supporting these people even before you can actually practice law. You can really make a change. It sounds like you have always had a drive to support more vulnerable people in your work.
That's correct. And I don't think I necessarily appreciated that when I had to write my bio for my book. And I was like, oh, yes, the editor sitting to, have you done that? I'm like, yes, of course I've done that. Have you done this? I'm like, of course I've done that. I'm like, oh, now I see why I've done all of those things.
Yeah, yeah,
Somebody has to
it's a
point it out.
well, that's interesting because a little bit later, before we finish this conversation, I'm going to ask you about celebrating successes, and it sounds like maybe you are challenged by that. So we'll find out. Um, all right. So talk us through this journey of coming to the United States and deciding to practice law here, and then how did you end up doing this immigration work?
It's interesting because I didn't ever think I'd be living in the US. B, I didn't know how to convert my education to becoming a lawyer here. And so while I was in the relationship with my husband, I was trying to figure out how I become a lawyer again. And living in Washington state, and of course, the United States legal system is very different from the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
I didn't know that there were 50 different states with 50 different licenses, with 50 different rules,
Yeah.
to how.
Brilliant, really brilliant, isn't it?
And I thought, how do I become a lawyer where I will be living? In the end, I realized I needed to take the New York bar exams. It's the only one I could take without going to school again. And by the time I started practicing law, I had enough of schooling. I didn't want to go to school anymore. I'm like, just
Yeah.
let me loose in the world, please. And so I took the New York bar exams. What I didn't appreciate yet is that a license to practice law in one state limits you in what you can practice in another one. And generally speaking, immigration, bankruptcy, maritime law, maybe IP law, there are a handful of laws that are federal, meaning that the practice of those laws are the same no matter where you live. And so immigration was one of them. And it seemed like it was following me. When I was
It
looking
sounds
for a
like
job,
it.
it really was. I had to write my resume, and I didn't know that a lot of the words I was using in my resume just made people puzzled about who am I. I
Mm.
wrote, I'm a legal assistant. And in the UK, a legal assistant is essentially a paralegal.
Ah.
A legal assistant in the US is a secretary. So my resume was reading secretary, 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 lawyer, and from a different country. So I don't think I was necessarily getting understood. But my own immigration lawyer by then had realized the potential, and she offered me a job. But what was interesting is that as soon as my green card had arrived in my hands and I was eligible to work, I had also passed the New York bar. 2 or 3 immigration jobs came my way. And I said, no, thank you. I'd seen immigration in the UK. I don't want to do it. Thank you very much. I'm going to maybe do litigation. It seemed like a natural fit, being a trial attorney.
Yeah.
But because litigation is generally state law, it wasn't a good fit at the time. So when my own immigration attorney said, well, let's just give you a chance and you work with me and then you can figure out what you do. I did that only because it was the best option at the time. But it was my 3rd or 4th immigration offer as well. And then the first day of doing immigration, I thought to myself, why was I fighting this? This is
The
everything that
first
I have.
day.
First day. It was so much more than what I thought it would be. I thought immigration law meant file asylum cases every day, cry about you cannot help but cry about the predicament that people are in. And I didn't want that weighing me down all the time. I'm an empath. I can't help but feel the pain that my clients go through. And I knew I needed to have something that would balance me out. And I realized immigration law doesn't have to be asylum law if you don't want it to be. You can work with companies, you can work with educated professionals making a difference in contributing their knowledge and brilliance and skills. And I realized that appeals to me, but it is also intellectually challenging for 2 reasons. The substantive part of the law is very challenging. It's most people will say it's second most complicated to tax law. Procedurally, it's challenging. You could say send the same form to 5 different offices. Which office do you send it to? And that changes often. And if you send it to the wrong office, you've now missed a deadline and somebody cannot work, possibly be illegal, and could possibly not come back into the US ever again. So the burden that is on you is actually very, very heavy. But that sort of impact that you can make in somebody's life is profound. And one of the things that I have realized in the last, I would say, 6 months, because I train so many people these days, is that I'm making a difference. I'm making an impact on lives and livelihoods for generations to come.
Absolutely.
And that's what appeals to me, that it's not just about the law in that moment. It's the transformation you're helping people make in their own lives. And it just occurs to me to say this because it never occurred to me before, is that I remember a lot of people in our community in the UK saying, well, your dad helped me come here. And now those are generations that are benefiting. I had never put those two together until this moment. But it is important, and that's why I love it. I love the practice of it. I love the impact it makes. But you mentioned earlier what's going on in the world, and there is a real timeliness about everything immigration. One of the things that I've been able to do in the last 5 years, particularly, is see what the community needs and find a way to match the needs with the skills that exist. And that's how the beginning of my career with all of that pro bono work really had come to fruition in that way, because meeting the needs of what the community goals are, community fears are, how to not necessarily dispel the fears, but help overcome those fears with the skilled professionals to help them, matchmaking essentially. And so it's been interesting that I have been able to use my education that I've developed over the last 20 years as an immigration attorney with my practical experience of being an immigration attorney on the ground, as an advocate, as an activist, and pulling it all together. So right this moment, I am helping some of our community leaders put together an event for Ukrainian nationals who are in the US that
Amazing.
need help, and they are worried about themselves, they're worried about their family members and friends back home. How do we get them information that they need in real time that is true and not misrepresented by bad apples in the game? And what are
Yeah.
we going to do next to get them the legal help that they will need?
And what type of that's amazing. I'm so pleased to hear you say that. What type of event are you putting together for them?
Well, the organization is called the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs for the City of Seattle. And they have been a tremendous beacon in the last several years, hosting and training and putting on events for immigrants. And so I'm collaborating with them with various hats that I wear. And that will hopefully be sometime next week.
Congratulations. That's amazing. And, you know, we said earlier, we talked about how the immigrant experience in the United States is vastly different depending on where they're immigrating from. And we're seeing that as Ukrainians or people in Ukraine try to leave Ukraine, where not everyone is getting across that border.
Yeah, it's
And
scary.
it's
Mhm.
really devastating. And I think it's important to say we can have all sorts of feelings about these things at once. I stand with Ukraine. And also, I vehemently do not agree that they should not let Africans cross the border. Like, this I feel very passionate about that. I'm not going to pretend that that's not horrible simply because I stand with Ukraine. And so
Mhm.
this stuff is nuanced. I can't imagine the work that you do is so complicated and nuanced.
Very much.
But
And no one situation is the same. Just,
exactly.
we're coming out on the heels of what has been going on in Afghanistan. And
Yes.
again, because of all the work I had done over the last 5 years, I was one of the early trainers, if you like. We were able to put a legal training for about 1,000 people within 2 weeks of Kabul falling so that lawyers could actually get you
That's
know,
amazing.
their hands on cases and make a difference. And what we saw with that is that the process for those individual applications were not necessarily effective because the system is not necessarily built for mass crisis situations.
Yeah.
And so that experience was very helpful in advocating for how we should potentially deal with Ukraine. And it might be a good point for me to mention that I have a biweekly column in a national magazine called online publication called Above the Law. And it has been a fantastic way for me to get my thoughts out there in real time. And so my article that came out just last Tuesday advocated for TPS, temporary protected status, which people might be hearing about now in the news. But there are some other advocacy points in it. So if you or any of your listeners are thinking, how can I help? How can I make a difference?
Yes. Yes.
Um, that article would be a good one to read to write your own letters to the editor of the
Mm,
newspapers, because people, that's how it's only 200 words. Most places will only take 200 words. Get your voice out there. How do you get your voice out there? Make a difference. And so you can take that article and take pieces out from there and make it your own.
that's amazing. Thank you. We will make sure to link to that in our show notes if anybody wants to check that out. And you bring up a really interesting point. So crisis things and it's come up and this is not a this conversation isn't about race relations in the United States, but it's fascinating Afghanistan, Syrian refugees treated very differently than what we're seeing with Ukraine. Um, some of that has to do with administration change, and some of it doesn't. What is the core difference between the term refugee and immigrant? I mean, I understand a refugee is fleeing a situation, but where is their overlap and how are they different?
Really good question. So, from an immigration lawyer perspective, the process is very different for each of them. Refugees are processed by the United Nations Human Rights Commission, and they have relations with organizations in the US that are resettlement organizations. And I can't tell you all of the nitty gritty steps that they take, but what happens is that the refugees get processed outside the United States. It takes several years to go through to step 1 to 10. I don't actually know how many steps there are. And when they arrive in the US, they are already refugees. They can get some social assistance, and they
Okay.
have permission to work immediately. An immigrant is somebody, and refugees are not necessarily not immigrants either. They are people who are
Right.
not from here, so to speak. But immigrants, the general way that they are portrayed as somebody who's come here and then they are seeking some immigration benefit. Um, as an immigration lawyer, I look at them separately and what the path is to getting here, what path do you need to take to get to the next stage. Immigrant as a generic term is everybody who's not necessarily born and raised in the US. You know,
Yeah.
at least from my perspective. Often it's, we say second generation immigrant because your parents came from somewhere else.
Sure.
And to be honest, if we were to trace everybody's steps back,
We are
we're
all
all
immigrants
immigrants.
except for the Native Americans. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And that's the thing that I have tried to make sure that comes out in any discussion I've had, because I had a family friend write to me a 20-page thesis about why immigrants should not come to the US and how they are taking everything. And yeah, this was somebody who had voted for the previous administration,
Uh-huh.
and I had not
Clearly.
known that until until I got that 20-page thesis. But what throws me is that the loss of memory, perhaps, or the understanding or the lack of acknowledgement of their own inheritance,
Absolutely.
heritage, because we all come from somewhere. And that remembrance is really important, because that is where compassion comes from. When people were coming on the Mayflower to the United States, when they were arriving at Ellis Island, they were not dissimilar from the Afghans fleeing their countries. They were not dissimilar from people who are fleeing Ukraine at the moment. That compassion comes from remembering, and forgetting or not acknowledging is really doing a disservice to us as a country, as a people.
Absolutely. That's profound. And I feel that so completely. Lots of folks are very short sighted with those types of things. Folks are so lucky to have someone as heart centered as you. But I imagine that your field is pretty heart centered. I don't, it would be hard to do the work that you do and be cold hearted.
I agree. I love my colleagues. I honestly do. And I really acknowledge every single person who stepped up to the challenge over the last 5 years in my book called The Legal Heroes in the Trump Era. I wrote that because I wanted to share the experience of all that we had done as a collective, but also to inspire people who were still wondering how they can make a difference. One of the things that most people said, and the book actually derived from a podcast series I had done. And you had mentioned the podcast, thank you, Tamina Talks Immigration. It was a series called Legal Heroes. And as I was recording the series, I realized, oh my goodness, all of these interviews need to be in one spot where I can pull it all together with how I found all of these people and what we did as a collective. But what most people said was donating money was not enough anymore. Sitting on the sideline was not enough anymore. I needed to do more with the skills I have. And a lot of immigration lawyers did that, of course, but a lot of lawyers in general stepped up to the challenge as well. But immigration lawyers as a group are empaths, are broad-hearted, generous, kind, loving, all of the adjectives you can think that are synonymous with love because of the work we do. It's because
Yes.
you're dealing with very hard, difficult issues. And even if you're doing business immigration every day, let's say, which is, dealing with the companies and so forth, you're still dealing with emotional issues. Your child is going to be 21 tomorrow and you still don't have a green card. How do you help that child? There are many, you use the word nuance. It's such a good word for immigration, particularly because even within one particular case, there are several different types of nuances. And how do you deal with those challenges one at a time? So you're right, and a big shout out to all my immigration lawyer friends. I just love them.
I love that. And I love your book, the book topic. Who is the book for?
The book is for anybody who's looking to make a difference.
Mm.
What happened in the previous administration, I think at least 51% of the population in this country were initially paralyzed and then basically looking for ways to step up and save
Yeah.
democracy, and everybody's got a different skill. Immigration was one of the key issues. Therefore, immigration was always in the news and the chaos was
Hmm.
ongoing. But civil rights, you name it, there were issues that people wanted to change, whether science isn't real, is climate change, education, Betsy DeVos, what she was doing with
Oh
education,
my gosh.
you
She makes my
name the
skin
issue.
crawl.
You name the issue, people wanted to make a difference. And
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure that people could see what lawyers did. You don't have to be a lawyer to read it. You read the lawyer's story and say, what can I do?
Yes,
And
I
that's
love
what I
that.
wanted to have. That's what I
Well,
wanted to have come across.
I will need to get a copy post haste. Maybe I can get a signed one. We can work that out.
Oh, I would love that. I would love to send you a signed copy. Yes,
We
yes,
can
yes,
work
yes. Send
out
me your
those
address.
details afterwards. I would love it. Folks, I will put Tamina's books. You have 2 books, right?
Correct. Yes, I have
Yes.
actually 3 books in practice, but really 2 books. One is a second edition, and the
Yes.
second edition is called the Startup Visa. That is advocating for a visa specifically for entrepreneurs, and we don't
Oh,
have one. And what was interesting about that book, the first edition, gave me a lot of historical education because if I'm writing a book, I have to be knowledgeable about why it's necessary and why history is as it is.
yeah.
And that's where I learned a lot about, how America came to be, how commerce began in this country, how entrepreneurs and the founding fathers had tried to shape this country. And I summarize a lot of it from an entrepreneurial perspective. And the second edition was really to say this is what happened in the last 5 years, which was nothing but a lot from a
Nothing
policy
but a lot.
perspective.
Yeah.
And I think there's momentum for change now. So that book is really for policymakers as well as immigrants so that they can make their cases stronger, but
Mm.
also policymakers how to advocate for change. But what was really interesting is just last week, I have launched a simultaneous second podcast called The Startup
Wow.
Visa, which is really a spin off from the book. And I love how it unfolded. I never thought about how to do a how to podcast and have a second pod. I mean, it's podcasting is
It
not
takes I'm
necessarily
like, I'm sitting here
easy.
wondering how you have time for all of this. My goodness.
So I'm excited. I'm so excited that I'll have 2 podcasts, and the second episode of the first season just dropped today. And it's about a lot of interesting subject matter. So I would love for people to tune in and subscribe and give me feedback.
Absolutely. Is there one place folks can go to figure out how I know you're on Twitter. I just followed you on Twitter so we can hang out with each other there, but find all of your social media platforms and
Yeah.
where your podcasts are, where should they go?
Well, LinkedIn is a great place to just connect if anybody wants to connect, but everything is on my work website because that's the only thing I can maintain is
Of course. Yeah.
www.watsonimmigration law. But there's a tab for books, a tab for podcasts, tab for all the media that I've been in, and it's a great place to connect. But I'm on all the social media platforms.
Okay, excellent. We'll put links to all of those in the show notes as well. And for those of you who don't know this, hopefully if you listen regularly, you do know if you go to vickeryandco.com/books, you will be able to access the Brave Files podcast guest library. So anyone we've ever had on the show, if they have a book out, it's featured there, and Tamina's books are there as well. So you have lots of ways to do that. Before we've a
Thank
couple
you.
more questions that I always ask. So everyone I know they're listening, they're like, "Well, aren't you going to ask her these questions?" And I am. And I hinted at this earlier. I am passionate about bravery and I'm passionate about celebrating success because I believe that if we just go and go and go without ever stopping to acknowledge the growth and the work and the effort, that we burn out and we can't bring our best selves to the table. So I'd love to know, how do you celebrate wins and successes?
I'm so glad you asked that question because I do believe people need to have some time for themselves. Because if you are not your best self, you cannot be the best for others. And the way I have
Absolutely.
actually discovered that is in COVID, where I have become a bird watcher and now I am a bird photographer. And in fact, just yesterday or this weekend, I launched my bird photography website where I'm actually selling my art.
That's
But what happens
amazing.
is, yeah, it's a shock to me too. It's a complete shock and surprise. And I'm just going through this. My husband's like, "So how much are the paintings and the draw?" I'm like, "I don't know. How much is this and what do you have to do?" "I don't know. I just have a website." I'm just getting started. But what the reason I mention that is you have to take stock of what you have done, even if you don't list them all out, and just know that you are doing the best that you can and you are making a difference. And so when
Mm.
I'm on my birding walks, and I have to say that I have never been more excited for daylight savings because I do everything in the morning when nobody needs me. And I'm
Yeah.
like, "Oh my god, I'm gonna have an extra hour in the morning to walk around
That's
in parks."
wonderful.
You but it gives me the time where I can think about, okay, that's how the podcast for the startup visa came along, because I didn't really think I had time for a second podcast. When would I do it? But if there's a will, there's a way. But I celebrate my success. Not that I ever really think about success. Is really just giving time for myself so
Yeah,
I can recharge and do the next thing as best as I can.
it's beautiful. I mean, there must be so many. I would imagine every time somebody actually gets their papers or their family is safe and they don't have to worry about being deported, you even if it's just sort of this internal moment of, "Oh, we did it."
Oh my
There's some
gosh.
celebratory acknowledgments.
All the time. I mean, my clients honestly inspire me and make me even more passionate. I was on this road trip for the school winter break, and I had a client who was coming in from Canada to here, but it wasn't an easy one. It was one of my startup clients, and this person had two or three rejections before they came to me. And so we won their case, which was not very easy at all. But that texting of, I'm at the border, I'm like, okay, I'm here. I'm just, if you need me, call me. I'm on your speed dial. And then to get the text, I'm in. And like, you
Uh,
want to jump up and down for that person. Yesterday,
yeah.
somebody got citizenship, but that person was very nervous. There were some issues that we had to walk this client through. And just to get that email saying, "Hey, I got my citizenship. Thank you so
Mm,
much." I know when I just said that generations to come, that's how it happens. This person doesn't
yeah.
have to worry about immigration anymore. There are so many moments, but one of the things I cherish the most is to sit down with my 12-year-old who now can understand a little bit more
Yeah.
and share some of these. Like, hey,
Oh,
mommy
thank
did this
goodness.
today, and mommy did that yesterday. And though she may not understand it all, I like to share it with her because, it's interesting. I didn't know that my kids were doing this. I have a 12-year-old and 9-year-old, and one of them was like, Mommy, I think you're more famous than Daddy. And I'm like, I'm not famous. She goes, no, I put your
I
name in
Google you.
Google. And I was like, oh, my baby thinks I'm famous. And so that's the big joy I have, that whether I'm famous or not, I don't consider that fame at all. But for them to be inspired and to know that they have a mom who's making a difference, and then I'm telling them the stories, that's what I cherish the most.
I love that. We have a similar story. My daughters think I'm a celebrity. They use the word celebrity because when you type my name in, my picture pops up. And she's 15 now, but when she was in like, fourth or fifth grade, she would say, if I really missed you at school, I would just Google you. You would come up.
Oh,
So I
oh my
love these
God, that's so
babies.
wonderful.
I love it. And
Yes.
I am so tickled that you shared with us about the birding and the art that's created from that and the quiet time and the time for yourself and the space to process and think and be and exist. And you are so busy. I know everyone listening is like, how in the world? 2 young children, 2 podcasts, 3 books, an actual thriving, successful immigration law practice. You're making the time to do this for yourself in the morning. And I just hope listeners, like, there's time, folks. If Tamina has time, you have time. Find
You know,
time because it's so important.
I have become an advocate for self-care, and the self-care started when the previous administration was making things very, very difficult. There's no way I couldn't bring work home, in my head at least.
Yeah.
But what was happening in the previous administration, it was spilling into my home. Like, I was like not the best self I could be to anybody around me.
Yeah.
And that's when the
Lots of
self-care
us.
began. But yeah, but to acknowledge that, I think, is important, because we
Yeah.
we are so proud that we don't acknowledge that we're not our best selves. And I accepting that, as an addict, you have to tell
Mm.
yourself you accept. I think that's the first step. And once I accepted that, I realized I needed to work on myself, and that I was working on myself, but COVID really gave me that time I needed. And now
Yeah.
I'm a pure believer advocate for anybody who is a professional, who's a mom. Any human being needs it, but when you're in leadership positions, I really believe you need to give yourself time, because that's
Absolutely.
important. And what I have, and I want to dispel the myth about the perfect life. So I just want to make sure my dishes don't get done, the kids don't have laundry all the time. We do the laundry when people are yelling for underwear.
Same here.
It's I and I I think people have to understand that you have to prioritize the things that are important to you.
Yeah.
And giving time to yourself is so much more important than the dirty dishes that will never be done. And
Absolutely.
so I think that's what I tell people.
Previous guest of ours, Audrey Kent, whose work is in people pleasing, Audrey said, um, I believe you can have it all. You just can't have it all at the very same time. And that
Absolutely.
feels resonant with what you just said. And also, who cares if the dishes aren't done? I mean, like, as long as
Exactly.
it's not unhealthy, like physically, like you don't get bugs or what, like these things are fine. It all works itself out. Doesn't have to be spot and spick and span. I had somebody, a babysitter years ago when my kids were really little, and she comes in and my house looks like I had a bunch of little kids, which I do. I did. And she said, my mom always told me if you go in to babysit and the parents' house is spotless, they're probably not very present parents.
I
So
love
there you
that.
go.
Okay. I feel so much better hearing that. I have to say, I am embarrassed about my pre-mother life. I was judgmental, like a lot
Yeah.
of single women, and I mean, I just am embarrassed about myself. And once I had kids, I apologized to many of my friends, where I thought, oh my gosh, why didn't you get this done on time? And, they'd be like, well, I was feeding my child and I wasn't necessarily as forgiving as I should have been. And
Yeah.
I apologize to a lot of people. I apologize to my mom for being a terrible daughter
Oh,
at
me
times,
too.
you
Me
know?
too. Yes.
And so I'm a much better human being for being a mother, a working
Mm.
mother, and an understanding professional.
I love that. Well, I just could keep talking to you forever and ever. And I'm actually hoping we can stay in touch. I'd like to collaborate with you on things, or if there's any way I can support any of the work that you're doing, I'd like to throw my hat in the ring because it's so
Oh,
important. And I love your energy
grateful.
and your passion. So thank you so much for that. But since we do have to bring the interview to a close at some point, will you share with us, Tamina, what your favorite charitable organization is to support?
My favorite organization at the moment, I would say, is the nonprofit that I had set up called Washington Immigrant Defense Network. This allows us to train lawyers to help in mass crisis.
Mm,
And that has become an incredibly important platform. While it was important over the last few years, it became even more important when we had to train lawyers to help Afghan nationals. And now we're
mm,
getting prepared to train lawyers to help Ukrainian nationals. And when we set up the nonprofit, it was really to help separated parents at the border. We had a lot of them come to the Washington state. But since then, it has become a primary way to address these timely crises where lawyers are needed in large numbers.
amazing. Thank you. They'll be our organization, charitable organization of the week. So we'll give them some social media love. But listeners, you know the drill, right? Check them out. Support how you can in whatever way you can. And there are lots of ways to do that. It could be time, it could be money, shares, social media likes, letting other people know they exist. Whatever your capacity is enough. And we appreciate you showing up for that. Tamina, will you share your 3 words with us one last time?
Embrace, inspire, and change.
Yeah, they're beautiful words, and they sum up your story so beautifully. This has been an absolute pleasure. I told Tamina just as we were coming on, I'm nursing a really bad back injury and I'm kind of a hot mess, and she can see me and she can tell. Hopefully you guys can't hear it, but this has been an incredible conversation and I'm so honored to be sharing this space with you. Thank you for being here.
I'm honored to. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, folks, I know that you enjoyed this just as much as I did. So go follow Tamina in all the places, like, subscribe, or follow. They don't call it subscribing now. Follow, share her show, this show. And remember that I always want to hear what's resonating with you. So find me on Instagram. We are at the Brave Files podcast on Instagram. Send me a DM. Let me know what you think of this show. If you have a guest suggestion for a show, or tell us how you're out choosing bravely. I will respond to those directly. And a reminder that I am doing a lot of hanging out on TikTok lately, which is hilarious to say out loud, but I would love to connect with you on TikTok. I'm at Brave Heather on TikTok. Thank you for being here. This is Heather Vickery reminding you today and every single day to go out and choose bravely. Bye. Hey, friends, I want to share something really exciting with you. We already know you enjoy listening to podcasts because you're listening to this one, but I'm also betting you enjoy audiobooks. And hey, listen, if you don't already enjoy audiobooks, then it's time to check them out. That's why I'm really excited to share Libro.fm with you. They are an incredible new platform for listening to audiobooks. And by choosing Libro.fm over other audiobook services, you are supporting a local bookstore of your choice and investing in your local community. Libro.fm offers over 150,000 audiobooks via their primary platform, which, by the way, they built with love and from scratch because they're a small business also. They even offer bookseller recommendations for great audiobook options. You can sign up right now via www.vickeryandco.com/LibroFM. That's vickeryandco.com/LIBROFM. And when you do, you'll get one free audiobook of your choice, and the proceeds will go to your favorite local bookstore. Now, check what I just said there. You're going to get a free book, and the proceeds are still going to go to your local bookstore because Libro.fm makes sure that their booksellers get paid even when they give a promo to customers. I've listened to over 20 audiobooks this year alone. I especially love listening to memoirs read by the author, and it feels great knowing that all of my purchases support my local bookstore, The Book Table, in Oak Park, Illinois. Libro.fm. The same audiobooks, the same price, but a completely different story. Check them out right now at vickeryandco.com/LibroFM. Have you ever thought about starting a podcast? Maybe you've had this thought and then quickly shut it down because who has the time? Or you don't know how, or gosh, it just all seems too hard. If you have something to share with the world, we want to encourage you to get your message out. The world needs to hear it. Did you know that 50% of all homes are podcast fans? If you've ever wondered about having your own podcast or how it can increase your business or get your message across, then please join me and the other experts from the Podcast Power Academy for our monthly free Q&A session. It's called So You Want to Start a Podcast? This casual live conversation will help you understand how podcasting can be a great decision, why now is the best time to get started, and how to get into action with it. Visit podcastpoweracademy.com to learn more. You've been listening to The Brave Files, stories of people living courageously. To learn more about the show, find our show notes and full episode transcripts, or to get some great bonus content, visit thebravefilespodcast.com. And we would love to know what you think of the show. You can give us a call at 312-646-0205. Let us know your thoughts on the episode, the show in general, or maybe share with us how you're out choosing bravely. This episode is brought to you by Vickery & Co. Success Coaching. Coaching that helps you maintain a life well lived and a business well run. Learn more at vickeryandco.com. Our music was created and produced in a custom collaboration with Matt Lewis from ML Creative Consulting, a boutique firm dedicated to helping clients identify their unique sound and amplify their brand with custom delivered soundtracks. We couldn't do any of this without our extraordinary audio engineer, Andrew Olson. Learn more about him and check out his work at findandrewolson.com. And special thanks to everyone on Team Brave, from our producers, associate producers, copy editors, writers, and support team. Special thanks to Molly, Mary, Kim, Sabra, and Sabrina. I'm your host and executive producer, Heather Vickery. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next week.